She didn't know, in that moment, that the sound of her own voice would terrify men who had never feared bullets. The headset crackled, static clawing at her ears, the wind roaring against the hull like something alive. She leaned closer to the console, eyes locked on a sea of black and white shapes pulsing across the thermal screen. Heat signatures moved like ghosts beneath the aircraft, small flickers in an endless dark. Someone on the ground was shouting now. Not panic, shock. The kind that comes when reality breaks apart too fast to understand. "Who the hell are you?" a voice demanded through the open channel. She answered without thinking, because thinking was a luxury combat never gave you. Just someone watching from the dark. The words felt small when she said them, almost casual, but she felt something shift immediately, a tension she couldn't see but could sense, like air before lightning. That was the night the legend began, not with a missile, not with a kill, but with a voice. Years earlier, Alex Carter had been invisible in ways that had nothing to do with darkness. She grew up in Ravenel, a quiet place where nothing ever happened and expectations were gentle, predictable, safe. No one in her family wore a uniform. No one spoke about war. Service was something you watched on television, something that happened somewhere else to other people. But even as a kid, she felt a pull she couldn't explain. Not toward violence, toward responsibility, toward the idea that someone had to stand between the innocent and the chaos, even if no one ever thanked them for it. When she enlisted at 18, people smiled politely and told her she was brave. Others told her she wouldn't last. She almost believed them during the first weeks of training, when her body shook from exhaustion and her confidence collapsed under shouted orders and constant evaluation. She couldn't march right. She asked too many questions. She failed more tests than she passed. At night, lying on a narrow bunk with muscles screaming, she wondered if wanting to serve was enough, or if strength was something you either had or didn't. But failure didn't push her out, it pulled her in. Every time she fell behind, she stayed late. Every time she doubted herself, she studied harder. When they introduced the Blackbird survival program, brutal, unforgiving, designed to break people who had never slept hungry or cold, she signed up because fear, she had learned, was often a compass pointing toward who you needed to become. She didn't belong there at first. She had never camped, never hunted, never slept on frozen ground wondering if rescue was coming. But she learned, slowly, painfully, and when it ended, she wasn't the timid girl from the suburbs anymore. She was someone who could endure. By the time she joined Nightwing Squadron years later, she understood something most people never did. Power didn't always come from being seen. Sometimes it came from being trusted. Nightwing flew low and ugly, slow enough to linger, strong enough to protect. It wasn't glamorous. It was necessary. She chose it because she didn't want distance. She wanted responsibility. She wanted to see the consequences of every decision. On her first combat operation, she didn't sleep. The weight of command pressed against her chest harder than any enemy fire ever could. Every coordinate she marked, every confirmation she gave, carried lives inside it. Friendly lives, enemy lives. The line between them was thin and unforgiving. When the vehicle appeared on her screen that night, headlights slicing through forbidden darkness, her pulse spiked. Civilian traffic didn't move there after sundown. Everyone knew that. Everyone except those who thought the dark belonged to them. She tracked it in real time, her voice steady while her thoughts raced. Distance, speed, occupants. When it turned into an unmarked compound, she stopped the strike without hesitation. "Hold," she ordered. "I need confirmation." Somewhere below, soldiers waited. Somewhere else, armed men gathered, unaware that they were already being measured, already weighed. When the confirmation came, she gave the order. The sky answered. Explosions bloomed like silent lightning on her screen. Vehicles burned. Shapes scattered. She didn't cheer. She didn't flinch. She watched. She calculated. She waited between strikes, reading movement, anticipating regrouping. War, she had learned, punished impatience. And then something unexpected happened. An allied commander opened the channel. He wanted the enemy to hear her voice, wanted them to understand who was destroying them. "You're done," he shouted. "An American woman is wiping you out from the sky. Surrender while you still can." Alex felt a cold knot form in her stomach. Not pride, not fear, something heavier. The effect was immediate. Weapons dropped, hands rose, men ran not toward cover but away. By dawn, hundreds surrendered, not because they were dead, because they were broken. Later, people would call her the Angel of Death. She never chose the name. She never liked it. Angels weren't supposed to carry guilt. After that night, everything changed. She was reassigned to Task Force Nightshade, a unit that didn't exist on paper. No insignias, no recognition, just maps, voices, and decisions that could never be undone. She stopped calling in strikes and started shaping entire operations. She learned when silence was stronger than fire, when restraint saved more lives than force ever could. She trained others, guided them through chaos using nothing but calm words and clarity. To them, her voice meant safety. It meant someone was watching, someone cared enough to stay steady when everything else fell apart. And slowly, stories began to reach her. About villages, about girls who listened from doorways when men spoke of the woman in the sky, about mothers who whispered hope instead of fear. Alex never saw herself as a symbol. She was just a voice, just a presence in the dark. But sometimes that was enough. Years later, when the noise faded and the missions ended, she sat alone with the weight of everything she had done and everything she had chosen not to do. The lives saved, the lives lost, the fine line she had walked without falling apart. She understood then what war had taught her, quietly and without mercy. Power doesn't always come from destruction. Courage doesn't always shout. And sometimes, dignity doesn't speak at all. It simply acts. Why did her hands start shaking only after the firing stopped? The sky had gone quiet in a way that never felt peaceful. Engines still hummed, screens still glowed, but the chaos below had thinned into scattered heat signatures, men kneeling, weapons abandoned, bodies pressed flat against the earth as if the ground itself might forgive them. Alex stared at the thermal display longer than she needed to, not because she was searching for threats, but because stopping meant feeling. She loosened her grip on the console and flexed her fingers. That was when she noticed it, the tremor, small, almost polite, her body finally asking permission to react now that the danger had passed. No one said anything over comms. The crew knew better. You didn't break the silence after something like that. You let it breathe. You let it settle. You let the person who gave the orders come back to themselves. Below them, dawn crept in slowly, pale and uncertain, revealing the aftermath in pieces. Burned vehicles, scattered equipment, long shadows stretching away from men who had believed the night belonged to them. Alex swallowed and keyed the mic. Her voice sounded normal again, calm, professional, like it always did. Ground units confirm secured detainees. Maintain perimeter. We're low on ammo. The acknowledgement came back steady, efficient, alive. That mattered most. Only when the aircraft banked away did she finally exhale. It felt like she'd been holding her breath for years. Back at the forward operating base, no one clapped. No one cheered. Success in their world didn't look like celebration. It looked like quiet nods, like coffee poured without asking, like someone setting down an extra blanket because they knew you wouldn't think to do it yourself. She sat alone on an ammo crate outside the tent, helmet resting at her feet, the cold creeping in through layers she hadn't realized were thin. The desert smelled different at dawn, burnt metal and dust, mixed with something faintly sweet she tried not to identify. A chaplain passed by and stopped. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, hands tucked into his coat, watching the horizon. "You did what you had to do," he said eventually. Alex didn't look at him. "I know." That was the problem. Knowing didn't make it lighter. Word traveled fast, even in places designed to erase records. By midday, the story had already changed shape. A woman's voice, hundreds surrendering, a name whispered through comms with a mixture of disbelief and awe. The angel of death. She hated it immediately. Not because it frightened people, because it simplified things. Angels weren't supposed to hesitate. Death wasn't supposed to regret. She requested reassignment within the week. Task Force Nightshade didn't ask questions. They never did. They only checked whether you understood what you were giving up. No public acknowledgement, no visible rank, no guarantees anyone would remember your name. Alex signed without hesitating. Nightshade operations happened behind layers of denial and silence. She moved from aircraft to command rooms, from open skis to sealed spaces humming with servers and screens. Maps replaced windows. Voices replaced faces. War became something you held in your head instead of your hands. At first, the distance helped. She could plan, anticipate, shape outcomes before blood ever touched the ground. She learned how insurgent cells moved, how fear traveled faster than orders, how rumor could destabilize entire regions without a single shot fired. She also learned how loneliness crept in when no one could know what you did. She trained young operators who still believed bravery was loud. She taught them otherwise, how to breathe through panic, how to wait when every instinct screamed to act, how to recognize the moment when restraint saved more lives than aggression ever could. They trusted her voice, not because it was gentle, but because it never lied. Late at night, after missions ended and reports were filed, Alex sat alone in the dim glow of the command room, replaying fragments she couldn't erase. The way a man had dropped his weapon before she ever gave the final order. The split second where mercy and hesitation had looked identical. She wondered who she was becoming. The doubt didn't weaken her, it sharpened her. Then came the mission that tested everything she believed. A city perched between control and collapse. Too many civilians, too many factions, too many years of resentment layered over fear. Intelligence suggested Umbra remnants were using a hospital complex as cover, not occupying it, hiding within it. Rules of engagement tightened until they felt like a noose. Alex spent 3 nights staring at the map, tracing routes with her finger, listening to intercepted transmissions that spoke in half-truths and desperation. She could level the area, end the threat quickly. It would be clean on paper. It would be unforgivable in reality. On the 4th night, she made a different call. Instead of firepower, she used the thing she understood best. Her voice. She opened an encrypted channel, one that Umbra leadership monitored obsessively. They believed knowledge was power. She believed clarity was. "This is the last warning," she said, calm as ever. "We know where you are. We know who you're using as shields. Walk away now. Leave the civilians. Disappear." Silence. She waited. "You think this is a bluff," she continued. "It is, but what comes next depends on you." Still nothing. Minutes passed, then a reply, mocking, dismissive. Alex closed her eyes for half a second. "You're afraid," she said quietly. "Not of us, of losing control. Because once you step out into the open, you're just men again, not myths." That did it. By morning, the hospital was empty of fighters. No shots fired. No airstrikes called. Just a steady evacuation, guided by fear and pride unraveling in real time. The ground team stared at the cleared corridors in disbelief. "How did you do that?" one of them asked over comms. Alex didn't answer right away. She was watching civilians step into daylight, confused but unharmed. "Sometimes," she said finally, "people surrender because they're beaten. Sometimes they surrender because they're seen." That mission didn't make headlines. None of hers ever did. But something shifted again, quietly. She started hearing stories, not reports, stories. about women in villages whispering her name like a question, about girls asking whether it was true that a woman's voice had stopped a battle, about fear loosening its grip just enough to let curiosity in. Alex never responded. Symbols were dangerous. They took on lives of their own. But late at night, when the command room dimmed and her reflection stared back at her from dark screens, she allowed herself one small, private hope. That maybe the weapon she had become didn't only destroy. That maybe it also protected things that would never know her name. And that if the darkness ever closed in again, she would still be there, watching, listening, choosing carefully when to speak. Because war had taught her many things, but the hardest lesson was this. Power isn't about how loudly you command. It's about how carefully you decide when to be heard. Why did the silence bother her more than the gunfire ever had? Alex noticed it during a mission briefing she barely spoke in. The room was full, operators, analysts, liaisons cycling in and out, but there was a hollow space inside her that hadn't been there before. When the screens went dark and the chairs scraped back, everyone else carried the noise with them. Laughter, complaints, the sound of life continuing. She stayed seated, staring at a frozen map long after it stopped meaning anything. Silence had once been her ally, now it followed her. Task Force Nightshade pushed deeper into gray zones where no one wore clean uniforms and allegiance shifted by the hour. These weren't battles you won with force. They were wars of patience, of pressure applied so slowly no one noticed the moment resistance cracked. Alex was good at it. Too good, some said. She could listen to intercepted chatter for hours and hear what others missed, not the words, but the fear beneath them, the hesitation, the lies people told themselves when they thought no one important was listening. Her voice still carried weight. When she spoke, rooms went still. When she issued instructions, people followed them without question. Trust like that should have felt reassuring. Instead, it felt heavy. The mission that haunted her most didn't involve surrender or victory. It involved waiting. A remote mountain corridor, supply routes feeding multiple insurgent cells. Ground teams were in position, cold and exposed, relying on her coordination to keep them invisible. Intelligence suggested a convoy would pass through before dawn. But dawn came, then full daylight. Nothing. The operators whispered frustration over comms. Muscles stiffened, nerves frayed. One wrong movement and the entire operation would collapse into chaos. Alex tracked every variable, weather patterns, signal anomalies, human impatience. She knew the convoy would come, but not when, and if she guessed wrong, people would die. Hours passed. Then a single heat signature appeared on the far ridge. A scout, young, nervous, alone. The team requested permission to engage. Alex felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the old instinct, remove the threat, control the situation. She denied it. Hold, she said, let him pass. There was a pause on the line, confusion, doubt. He'll alert the others, someone argued. Not yet, Alex replied. He's not sure what he saw. She watched the figure hesitate, then move on, disappear into the terrain. Minutes later, another signature appeared. Then another. The convoy followed exactly as she'd predicted, slower now, cautious, unaware that restraint had saved them from walking into an ambush unprepared. When the operation concluded successfully hours later, no one mentioned the scout again, but Alex did. She replayed that moment over and over that night, lying awake in a narrow bunk, staring at a ceiling she didn't recognize. She had spared a life, and she didn't know how to feel about it. The problem wasn't guilt, it was responsibility. Every decision carved a mark somewhere. You couldn't always see where, but you carried them all the same. As months passed, her reputation grew quieter but deeper. Operators asked for her by name, not because she promised safety, but because she promised honesty. If she said a mission was dangerous, it was. If she said wait, they waited. She never lied to make things easier. Then came the operation that forced her to confront the part of herself she'd been avoiding. A joint task with local forces, fragile alliance, mistrust threaded through every interaction. The objective was simple on paper: extract a high-value asset without igniting open conflict. The complication was human. The asset was a woman, captured years earlier, used as leverage, forgotten by everyone except a few stubborn intelligence officers who refused to let her disappear into footnotes. Alex studied the file long into the night. The woman had been a teacher, no combat role, no political power, just someone who'd said the wrong thing at the wrong time. Rescue attempts had failed before, too risky, too visible. Alex volunteered anyway. Not because it was strategic, because she couldn't stop thinking about it. The extraction unfolded in fragments, narrow windows, shifting loyalties, a constant risk of betrayal. Alex coordinated from a mobile command unit, voice threading through chaos as ground teams navigated corridors and checkpoints where fear did most of the talking. At one point the team was pinned, negotiations stalled, weapons raised on both sides. Alex opened the channel. She didn't threaten, she didn't command. She spoke about consequences, about what would happen after the shooting stopped, about who would be blamed, about how violence never ended cleanly, it only spread. Her words weren't dramatic, they were deliberate. The standoff broke. The woman was extracted under cover of confusion, rather than force. Later, when she was safe, she asked to speak to the person who'd guided the operation. Alex declined. She watched through a camera feed instead as the woman wrapped herself in a blanket, eyes hollow but alive. That night Alex finally cried. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to remind herself she still could. The next day she returned to work as if nothing had changed. That was the rule. You didn't carry victories or failures into the next mission. You reset. You adapt. But something inside her had shifted. She began mentoring differently, asking questions instead of issuing instructions, listening more than speaking when voices overlapped. She encouraged doubt, not as weakness, but as proof that conscience was still intact. Some didn't like it, they wanted certainty. Black and white, orders without ambiguity. Alex understood that need. She just couldn't satisfy it anymore. War had stripped away her illusions one layer at a time. What remained wasn't heroism, it was responsibility. Late one evening, an operator she'd trained years earlier requested a private channel. "Why do you hesitate now?" he asked, not accusing, just curious. Alex thought carefully before answering. "Because I've learned that hesitation means I still see people," she said. "And the day I don't, that's the day I shouldn't be here anymore." There was a long silence after that. "I'm glad you are," he said eventually. She closed the channel and sat alone in the dim command room, surrounded by maps of places she'd never visit and people she'd never meet. She understood then that the angel of death had never been about fear. It had been about presence, about being the voice that stayed calm when others broke, about choosing restraint when destruction was easier, about accepting that redemption didn't come from erasing darkness, but from refusing to become it. And though the silence still followed her, she no longer feared it. Because silence, she had learned, was often the space where conscience spoke loudest. And as long as she could still hear it, she knew she hadn't lost herself yet. What happens when the voice everyone trusts starts doubting itself? The question surfaced without warning during a routine systems check. Alex was alone in the command unit, lights dimmed, screens cycling through diagnostics that no longer required her full attention. Outside, the base slept in fragments, guards packing, generators humming, the distant clatter of metal in the cold. It should have felt familiar. Instead, it felt fragile. She caught her reflection in the dark glass of a monitor, tired eyes, calm posture, a woman who sounded certain even when she was. That disconnect had been growing for months. Nightshade didn't pause, it never did. Operations stacked on top of one another until time blurred into a sequence of voices and coordinates. Alex moved through it efficiently, professionally, but inside she felt something thinning. Not resolve, trust, her trust in herself. The next mission came with urgency stitched into every briefing slide. A border town, strategic crossroads. Intelligence suggested Umbra remnants were embedding advisors, quietly rebuilding influence. Not enough to justify overt action. Too much to ignore. Local forces were jumpy. One wrong move could ignite retaliation that would swallow civilians whole. Alex studied the town for days. Markets opening at dawn, children weaving through alleys, old men drinking tea beneath awnings that had survived 3 conflicts already. War didn't arrive there loudly. It seeped in, patient and disguised as normalcy. Ground teams requested permission for targeted strikes. Limited, precise. Alex delayed. She listened to intercepted transmissions late into the night, not the ones marked urgent, the ones everyone else skipped. Arguments over food, jokes told badly, a man worrying about his daughter's cough. These were the voices behind the threat. She knew the cost of action. She also knew the cost of waiting. When she finally spoke during the briefing, the room stilled. "We don't strike," she said. "Not yet." A few heads lifted, someone frowned. "We monitor," she continued. "We apply pressure indirectly, cut resources, disrupt communications, let the network collapse under its own weight." A pause, then questions, risks, concerns. Alex answered them all, calm, clear, convincing. Afterward, one of the senior analysts pulled her aside. "You're changing," he said carefully. She met his gaze. "I hope so." That night the town remained quiet, and so did she. 3 weeks later, everything unraveled. An Allied patrol, operating outside her recommended parameters, stumbled into an ambush on the outskirts of the town. Confusion, crossfire, panic, calls for immediate air support flooded the channels. Alex was already moving, issuing rapid instructions, redirecting assets, coordinating evacuation routes. Her voice didn't shake. It never did. But this time, there wasn't enough time. By the time extraction completed, 2 Allied soldiers were dead. Civilians were injured in the chaos that followed. The town erupted, not in violence but in anger. Trust fractured. Reports landed on Alex's desk like accusations. If we had struck earlier, if we hadn't waited, if she hadn't hesitated. No one said it outright, they didn't need to. Alex shut herself in the command unit long after the base quieted. She replayed every decision, every delay, every alternative path that might have ended differently. The weight pressed down until breathing felt deliberate. This was the cost no one prepared you for, not the dead, the doubt. For the first time in years, she requested leave. It wasn't rest she wanted, it was distance. She traveled to a smaller installation, far from active theaters. No operations, no command responsibilities, just training oversight and paperwork that didn't carry lives inside it. The quiet there was different, honest, uncluttered. She walked the perimeter at dusk, boots crunching over gravel, watching recruits stumble through drills she'd once struggled with herself. Their faces were eager, afraid, hopeful. She remembered being them. One evening a young woman approached her hesitantly, new, sharp-eyed, nervous. "Ma'am," she said, voice steady despite her hands, "can I ask you something?" Alex nodded. "Is it true," the recruit asked, "that you're the one they call the Angel of Death?" The words hung between them, awkward and heavy. Alex considered correcting her, denying it, explaining the reality behind the myth. Instead, she asked, "Why do you want to know?" The recruit hesitated. Because, if it's true, I want to understand how someone lives with that. Alex felt something inside her soften. I live with it by remembering I'm not an angel, she said quietly. And I don't decide who deserves to die. I decide how hard I try to protect what's left. The recruit absorbed that, nodding slowly. That night Alex sat alone and wrote for the first time in years. Not reports, not plans, thoughts, doubts, names she'd never said out loud. She didn't justify herself. She didn't absolve herself. She acknowledged. When Nightshade called again, she answered. The mission was different, smaller, surgical. A single operative trapped deep in contested territory, compromised extraction, limited options. Alex returned to the command chair without ceremony. Familiar weight, familiar responsibility. As she guided the operative through narrow escapes and shifting danger, something settled back into place. Not certainty, purpose. The operative hesitated at one point, breathing hard, fear bleeding into his voice. I can't see a way out, he said. Alex leaned closer to the mic. Then trust me, she said, I can. He did. The extraction succeeded with seconds to spare. Afterward, alone again, Alex realized the doubt hadn't disappeared. It didn't need to. Doubt wasn't the enemy, detachment was. She had waited too long once, not because she didn't care, but because she cared deeply and feared the consequences of being wrong. She accepted that lesson without letting it harden her. War didn't reward perfection, it punished certainty. As the sun rose over the base, Alex stood watching light spill across the horizon, thinking of the town, the patrol, the choices that could never be undone. She didn't seek forgiveness, she sought balance. Because redemption, she was learning, wasn't about erasing mistakes. It was about carrying them honestly. And as long as she could still feel the weight of her decisions, she knew her voice hadn't lost its humanity. It hadn't become an instrument of death. It had become something harder. A conscience that refused to go silent. When did the fear stop belonging to the enemy and start living inside her? Alex felt it in the pause before she spoke. The command room was full, lights low, screens alive with overlapping data streams. The mission was already in motion. Ground teams advancing through a fractured industrial district where every shadow could hide a trigger, every doorway could become a trap. She had briefed this operation herself. She knew the routes, the contingencies, the risks. Still her throat tightened. She forced herself to breathe before opening the channel. Raptor 3, hold position, she said, voice even. You're drifting too far east. The acknowledgement came back quick, trust without hesitation. That trust was heavier than fear. The operation had been classified as recovery, not combat, an extraction of a former intelligence asset who'd gone dark months earlier, presumed dead, now confirmed alive, hiding among people who would kill him just for existing. Alex had reviewed his file dozens of times, not because of its importance but because of its ending, terminated cooperation, unstable, liability. He reminded her uncomfortably of herself. As the teams moved deeper into the district, communications flickered, interference spiked. Someone was actively hunting their signals. Alex adjusted frequencies, rerouted relays, issued microcorrections in real time. Her voice flowed smoothly, practiced, precise. Inside, something coiled tighter with every step forward. This wasn't doubt, this was something else. This was memory. The district mirrored another place she'd once watched burn from above. Same narrow lanes, same layered rooftops, same way sound folded in on itself until you couldn't tell distance from direction. She pushed the thought aside. The present demanded her full attention. Then a voice cut through the channel, ragged, unfamiliar. They know we're here. The ground teams froze. Alex felt the moment stretch thin, fragile. She could call it, pull them out, accept failure, or she could press forward and risk everything. She remembered the town she'd waited too long to protect, the patrol she hadn't saved. Her finger hovered over the mic. "Proceed," she said. "Slow, quiet, trust the shadows." Minutes crawled, then a muffled exchange, a sudden spike in movement, weapons raised but not fired. And then another voice. Older, hoarse, laughing softly. "I knew you'd come," the man said over an open channel he had no right accessing. "The woman in the dark." Alex's heart dropped. He knew her. He shouldn't have. "End transmission," someone urged. Alex didn't. "You're risking your life by speaking," she said calmly. "Step out where my people can see you." The laugh again, tired, sad. "I already lost my life," he replied. "You were there, remember?" She did. Years ago, a city under siege. He had been an intermediary, useful, dangerous, unstable. She'd chosen to pull assets back instead of reinforcing his position. The intel hadn't justified the risk. He'd survived anyway, barely. "I trusted you," he continued. "Your voice, you said wait, you said help was coming." Alex closed her eyes for half a second. "I was wrong," she said quietly, "and I'm still here." Silence followed, not tactical, personal. Finally he spoke again. "So am I." What followed wasn't combat. It was negotiation stripped of pretense. Alex spoke to him not as an operator but as someone who understood betrayal intimately. She didn't excuse herself. She didn't defend the decision. She acknowledged the cost. Slowly, cautiously, the standoff dissolved. The man emerged, hands empty, eyes hollow but alive. Ground teams secured him without resistance. Extraction proceeded under tension, so thick it felt physical. Only after the aircraft lifted did Alex allow herself to lean back, pulse racing. She hadn't used fear as a weapon. She had faced it. In the days that followed, the debriefs were clinical: successful recovery, minimal exposure, lessons learned. None of them captured what mattered. The man requested to speak with her before relocation. Alex hesitated, then agreed. He looked smaller in person, older, less dangerous than the files suggested. Trauma had hollowed him out in ways no report could quantify. "You came back," he said simply. "Yes." "Why?" Alex thought carefully. "Because leaving you behind didn't end when the mission did," she said. "It followed me." He nodded, as if that answered everything. When he was gone, relocated to safety she would never know, Alex returned to work carrying something lighter and heavier than before. The fear hadn't vanished, it had transformed. It no longer whispered about failure. It reminded her of consequence. She mentored differently now, spoke openly about mistakes, about the weight of choices that couldn't be undone. Some operators struggled with that honesty, others leaned into it. One night, reviewing logs alone, Alex realized something that startled her. The angel of death no longer fit. She wasn't a symbol of surrender anymore. She was a reminder of return, of coming back to the places you'd abandoned, physically or morally, and standing there without excuses. War would never stop asking her to choose, to act, to risk being wrong. But fear no longer lived inside her as paralysis. It lived there as proof. Proof that she still cared enough to be afraid. And as long as that remained true, her voice would never belong to death alone. It would belong to accountability, to memory, and in its own quiet way, to redemption. What does a voice become when the war no longer needs it? Alex didn't notice the change at first. There was no ceremony, no final mission marked in red ink, no moment where someone told her this is the last time. The work simply slowed. Briefings shortened. Calls came later, sometimes not at all. The silence returned, but this time it felt different. She sat in the command room one evening long after most of the base had gone dark, listening to the low hum of machines that no longer needed her constant attention. Screens idled. Maps froze in places she knew by heart. For years, her voice had threaded through chaos, shaping outcomes she would never see. Now, the world seemed to be learning how to move without her. That realization should have frightened her. Instead, it made her tired. The final operation came quietly, a regional stabilization effort, advisors embedded, no imminent threats, no dramatic stakes, just a fragile piece that needed time more than force. Alex coordinated the handoff with meticulous care. Introductions made, trust transferred, voices replaced. When the last channel closed, she removed her headset and set it down gently, as if it might bruise. No one was watching. She stayed there for a long time, hands folded, breathing slow, letting the weight lift without rushing it away. This was what she had worked toward, even when she didn't know it. A moment where restraint wasn't a choice, but a condition. Outside, dawn broke clean and pale. No smoke, no urgency. She walked the perimeter one last time, boots familiar against gravel, air sharp with cold. The base felt smaller now, stripped of its tension. Human, temporary. A young officer approached her near the gate, nervous, respectful. "They say you're leaving," he said. She nodded. "I wanted to ask, how do you know when you've done enough?" Alex considered him carefully. Saw herself there, years ago, asking different questions with the same hunger. "You don't," she said honestly. "You just know when staying would cost you something you're not willing to give up." He absorbed that, unsure but grateful. As she packed her things, few as they were, Alex found the old blue notebook she'd carried through her early years. Pages smudged with dust and sweat, coordinates long outdated, notes written in a younger hand, sharper, more anxious. She flipped through it slowly. Names, frequencies, reminders to breathe. At the back, tucked between pages, was a scrap of paper she didn't remember writing. A single line, uneven. "Don't become what you're fighting." She smiled faintly. Leaving the base didn't feel like escape. It felt like release. She traveled without urgency, watching landscapes shift beneath her window, cities waking, villages enduring, ordinary life continuing without knowing how close it had come to unraveling. That anonymity was a gift. She settled somewhere quiet. No fences, no radios, just space. Mornings came without alarms. Nights passed without voices calling her back into the dark. At first she struggled. The absence of command left her restless. Purpose, she learned, didn't vanish politely. It echoed. But gradually, the noise inside her softened. She began speaking again, just not into headsets. She taught, advised, listened. Sometimes she spoke to rooms full of people. Sometimes to one person sitting across from her, hands wrapped around a cup they didn't realize was shaking. She never told the stories the way others wanted. No dramatics, no myth. She spoke about hesitation, about doubt, about the cost of certainty. One afternoon at a small training seminar, a woman approached her afterward. Civilian, older, steady-eyed. "My daughter listens to stories about you," she said carefully, "about a woman whose voice stopped a war." Alex shook her head gently. "That's not what happened." The woman smiled. "I know, but the story helps her sleep." Alex felt something warm, an unfamiliar rise in her chest. "Then let it," she said. Years passed. The world shifted as it always did. New conflicts, new voices, new shadows. Alex followed them from a distance, no longer responsible, no longer central. And yet sometimes, late at night, she would hear it. The memory of her own voice, steady and clear, cutting through chaos. She didn't miss it. She honored it. One evening, as the sun dipped low, and the air filled with that soft, reflective quiet that comes before night, Alex sat alone and thought about all the moments she'd carried. The man who surrendered because he was seen. The patrol she couldn't save. The teacher pulled from captivity. The recruit who asked how to live with a name like that. She understood now that none of those moments defined her alone. They were shared, held together by choices made under pressure, by people doing the best they could with imperfect information and fragile hearts. The angel of death had never been about fear. It had been about presence in the moment, when fear ruled everything else. About a woman who refused to look away, who spoke when silence would have been easier, who stayed human when it would have been simpler not to. Alex stood and watched the last light fade, feeling neither absolved nor condemned. Just complete. War had taken many things from her: youth, innocence, illusions. But it had given her something rare: the understanding that strength doesn't always arrive with force, that surrender isn't always weakness, and that the most powerful weapon is not the one that ends a life, but the one that reminds us we still have a choice. Because sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It listens, it waits, and when the moment comes, it acts.